Hello, friends. Welcome to our continuing study on the life of Samuel. We tentatively called this study Strange Days Indeed. Corrie ten Boom has that wonderful quotation that if we look at the world, we'll be distressed. If we look to ourselves, we'll be depressed. But if we look to God, we will be at rest. And there's few people in the Bible who seem to truly be able to keep their focus on God. And Samuel was one of those people. So just a quick programming note. You are watching this on December 3rd. I'm actually recording this on December 2nd with my morning coffee, so you get to join me for that. We're going to have one more session on the 10th of December, Thursday night. Next Thursday night, we'll finish up this study, and that will conclude this particular installment of the study of Samuel's life through 1 Samuel. Now, what I'm going to do in the spring semester, when we kick off in January, I'll be doing an in-person study on the latter half of 1 Samuel, and we get into the life of King David, who, of course, outside of Jesus, he is the most important figure in the Bible. There's more chapters given to the life of David than anybody else in the Bible except for Jesus. David has 66 chapters altogether in the Bible that talk about him, and that's not even counting the Psalms, which he wrote many of those. So we're in 1 Samuel 15 tonight. We've already seen Saul rejected as king of Israel. What tonight's going to point out is that Saul's rejection as king of Israel was not just because of a one-time event, because he jumped the gun and offered a sacrifice. He stepped over the line and stopped being a king and tried to be a priest, all those things. So this is not just a one-time event. This is an ongoing character issue for Saul. So this is chapter 15, verse 1, and we're just going to walk through this chapter tonight. Samuel told Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people. Now listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord of armies says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to Israel when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt." Okay, what's happening here? So Saul is approached by Samuel. Again, he's already been rejected. His dynasty has been rejected, but Saul is still king. So God has something that he wants Saul to accomplish, and that is the eradication of the Amalekites. Now, let me talk about who they are, okay? If you go all the way back to Exodus 17, as the Israelites are coming out of Egyptian slavery, and they're beginning to cross the desert, the Amalekites, basically you could use the word terrorist. They're a terrorist. They were pillagers. They were raiders. And what they did is they picked off the weak, they picked off the old, those who were straggling, and they terrorized Israel. Okay, they were just, and again, the word terrorist is the best word to use. And God remembered this, and it probably had been in the people's collective memory as well. But God said, I've not forgotten what the Amalekites did back then, and they haven't changed. They still were terrorist people, raiding people. Verse 3, now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Now, you're going to hear some things that are a little hard for us to understand, but I just keep coming back to this, that with a true terrorist, you can't negotiate with a terrorist. A true terrorist, there's no negotiation. They hate your life more than they love their own. And so they're willing to do anything, including die, in order to cause destruction. And that phrase, completely destroy, is used 7 times in this passage. So it's very clear. God says, I want you to completely destroy the Amalekites. And because that is not done, we'll see later on in biblical history the consequences of that. Okay, completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men, women, infants, nursing babies, oxen, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Then Saul summoned the troops and counted them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men from Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set out to ambush the wadi. So he finds them in a dry creek bed. We would call that, in West Texas, we'd call that an arroyo. Here in Oklahoma, we call it a gulch or a gully. But the people were living in a wadi, a dry riverbed. He was ready to ambush. He warned the Canaanites, since you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, go on and leave, get away from the Amalekites, or we may sweep you away with them. So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. So who are the Kenites? The Kenites are actually a Midian people, and Moses's father-in-law and wife were Midianites. All right, so Kenites were a kind of a subclan of the Midianites, and they were known for their metalwork. In fact, the word Kenite just kind of is synonymous with smith, like a coppersmith or an ironsmith, a metal worker, right? So it's interesting because they remembered that the negative, the people that had betrayed them or had hurt them. They also remember the people who had been kind to them. In fact, just that word kind, if you just lop off the end of that, and the first three letters is kin, K-I-N. It's treating people with kindness, with kinness, that you're related to them. It's like a family. So this is distant family, and they're going to communicate that kindness by saying, you want to get out of here now, this is going to be bad, and we don't want to hurt you with them. Then Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt. He captured King Agag of Amalek alive, but he completely destroyed all the rest of the people with the sword. Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, choice animals, as well as the young rams and best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. Okay, so we see here that Saul does not obey the command that Samuel gave him. He said, completely destroy, wipe out everything. And what you're going to see Saul here doing for the balance of this chapter is making excuses, and Samuel just keeps confronting him on his excuses until he finally says, you're right, I've sinned. And we're going to walk through this. So notice that Saul's victory is briefly recorded in verse 7, but the real matter is that he didn't fully obey the Lord. Delayed obedience is disobedience. Partial obedience is disobedience. Okay, so there would be ramifications of this later, and obviously all the Amalekites were completely destroyed in this region, but there are probably some stragglers that got away. Okay, now where this is going to come back to bite them is later on in Hebrew history. If you read the book of Esther, Haman, the arch enemy of the Jewish people, Haman he's referred to as an Agagite. He was a descendant of Agag, all right? So because Saul didn't completely eradicate these people, later on one of those descendants would have it in for the Jewish people and would nearly cause the eradication of the Jewish people if God had not intervened through Queen Esther. So you see that when we disobey in the current moment, it can have future and generational impact, all right? So they got rid of the unwanted things but kept the really good things. Excuse me, speaking of good things, this is verse 10. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. So here we see, and while Samuel maintained his focus on the Lord, didn't mean that he didn't have moments of discouragement. And he didn't really want Israel to have a king to begin with. But when Saul was chosen, he jumped in with both feet. And now he's angry at the course of events. And he takes that anger and that discouragement to the Lord. So early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul. But it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel where he set up a monument for himself. So he went to a place, found out Saul wasn't there, kind of through the bush telegraph, found out where he was. Then he turned around and went to Gilgal. Verse 13. When Samuel came to him, Saul said, "May the Lord bless you." You know, I've noticed this tendency, and I've noticed it in me too, that whenever I want to dress up some of my bad agendas, I'll use religious cliches. When I want to hide the fact that I'm struggling with something or that I've not done what I'm supposed to, I'll throw in some religious words. I often talk to people who are are toying with the sin, and they're going to say, well, I'm going to see where the Lord leads. It's just this religious cliche. May the Lord bless you. Samuel just kind of defaults, or Saul defaults to some Jewish religious cliches. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. He seems to be defending himself almost immediately. Samuel hasn't asked anything yet, but Saul already said, hey, God bless you, brother. And yeah, I did everything you told me to. Oh, Samuel hadn't even asked that yet, right? So verse 14, Samuel replied, then what is the sound of sheep and goats and cattle that I hear? Saul answered, and now he's going to blame the troops. The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep, goats, cattle in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. So not only does he blame the troops, but he says, but their motive was good, but the rest we destroyed. So here he's trying to cast blame, but even those he blames, he says, their intent was good. They were going to sacrifice to the Lord. Verse 16, stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord has said last night. Tell me, he replied. Verse 17, Samuel continued, although you once considered yourself unimportant, have you not become the leader of the tribes of Israel? In other words, Samuel's saying here, you're the king. It's time for you to act like it. You and I both know that the troops wanted to plunder, but you should have stood up to your troops and said, no, this is the Lord's command. Your job is to lead sentiment, not follow sentiment. All right. You once considered yourself unimportant, but you became a leader. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, verse 18. And then he sent you on mission and said, go and completely destroy the Amalekites. There's that command again, okay? Fight against them until you have annihilated them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? That's a great question. Just to sit on that question. Anytime we're toying with sin, why don't we obey the Lord? Why did you rush on plunder? Why did you do evil in the Lord's sight? So Saul's going to stick to his guns here, okay? But I did obey the Lord. The implication here is, there's a couple of different ways to interpret this command, No, the command was completely destroy. Kind of hard to misunderstand that. Or he could be saying, I completely obeyed, but the soldiers didn't, right? But I did obey the Lord. I went on mission the Lord gave me. I brought back King Agag of Amalek, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops, they took the sheep, goats, and cattle from plunder, the best that was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So now, why would God want them to destroy all the sheep, goats, and cattle? They didn't do anything wrong, right? So why was that command to completely destroy? And I probably should have dealt with this earlier. I think there's a principle here is you don't want to become enriched by evil. The Amalekites were raiders, and so everything they had, they'd pretty much stolen. So for the Israelites to take that, they would be enriching themselves because of the evil deeds of others. And I always say this, we need to be careful as followers of Jesus that we don't enrich ourselves by evil. And be careful who you do business with. And that's just, if you don't trust somebody, if you wouldn't trust somebody to come to invite over to your house, don't do business with them, right? Verse 22, and Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? And here's one of the quintessential passages of the Older Testament. Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. In other words, a right relationship with God is so much better than all these religious rituals. The rituals are important, but only insofar as they reflect a true relationship that you have. To obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance is like the wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord has rejected you. Now finally Saul comes clean. Saul answered Samuel, I have sinned. I have transgressed the Lord's commands and your words. That word transgress there means to pass over, to cross over, literally to trespass, right? So I've gone too far. Because I was afraid of the people, I obeyed them. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so that I may worship God. So he knows he blew it. But Saul's main concern here is not what God thinks of him, but what the people think of him. Because now it's time to go worship, and he wants Samuel to go with him. Samuel replied to Saul, I will not return with you, because you rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And when Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed the corner of his robe and tore it. So just think about a robe. Think about the thickness of the fabric. Okay, and you take it in your hands and you try to tear it. You know that's going to be hard to do. This is not where Saul reached out and grabbed the corner and just a seam happened to rip away. This is a pretty violent scene here. Imagine the force required of Saul pulling and Samuel walking away, and the force required to rip that kind of thick, coarse fabric. Okay, so this is a very, very violent scene, and it turns out to be a performed parable. Okay, I will not return with you. Saul grabbed the corner of his robe and it tore. Samuel said, verse 28, the Lord has torn the kingship of Israel away from you today and has given it to your neighbor, someone who is better than you. Furthermore, the Eternal One in Israel does not lie or change his mind. He is not a man that he changes his mind. Saul said, I've sinned. Please honor me now before the elders of the people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may bow down and worship your God. It's a little slip right there. To worship your God. At some point, the Lord stopped being Saul's God, and now Saul sees him as Samuel's God. A little bit of a slip there, but I think it's very indicative of his relationship with the Lord. By the way, here, Numbers 23:19 is a good reference. God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? God keeps his word. Okay. I've sinned, verse 30. Please honor me now before the elders of the people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may bow down and worship the Lord your God. And Samuel went back, following Saul, and Saul bowed before the Lord. Samuel said, bring me Agag of Amalek. So this is the really tough scene here. Agag came to him trembling, for he thought, certainly the bitterness of death has come. Agag is a bit humbled. For a warrior like him, he would rather do anything but die as a captive. I'd rather die in battle with a sword in my hand rather than my hands tied behind my back. Samuel declared, your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. Then he hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Samuel went to Ramah, and this is kind of the tragic footnote here. Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his home in Gibeah. Even to the day of his death, Samuel never saw Saul again. Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So Ramah and Gilead are 10 miles apart, and they each went back to their home, and they never really saw one another again, and there was a break in this relationship, and Saul would increasingly become isolated, and he would continue to spiral down into mental and spiritual darkness. But Samuel did not delight in evil. He delighted in good. And so he mourned for Saul. He wanted Saul to be a success. And here's kind of the final lesson as we draw this time to a close. Saul, in Samuel's eyes, was a failure. And maybe Samuel was tempted to think this whole kingship thing is just a failure. But as we're going to see in the next chapter, God didn't let Samuel mourn for very long, because he said, now I want you to take your horn of oil, go and anoint a new king, and this would be David, that not only would fulfill the promise of having a political king over Israel, but having a spiritual king over all the nations of the world. The line of David would bring about Jesus. So just at the moment you think you're the greatest failure, it could be the greatest successes. And God's purpose is about to be fulfilled. All right, so that's it for 1 Samuel 15. Thanks for joining me for this study tonight. Listen, we'll wrap up this study next week, next Thursday night, same time. And I hope you feel comfortable returning in person when you're ready. We're continuing to do this study in line. We do online, in person. It parallels one another. So when you're ready to come back, you may do that at any time. Lord bless you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.